Flight instructing. To date, acquiring my flight instructor certificate has been the best investment I've ever made. Lots of new commercial pilots wince at the idea of undergoing even more flight training and stepping up to the plate to take what is widely regarded as the most difficult check ride in aviation. Stories abound of 8+ hour oral exams and the lowest pass rate of any check ride, and while some of these stories may be true, every day the list of certificated flight instructors grows. The reality is that, by far, your best bet for finding a job as a low-time commercial pilot is to get your flight instructor certificate and instruct. Why? Recall the list of obstacles in the previous section. In terms of regulations, once you have your commercial pilot certificate, there is no additional minimum aeronautical experience requirement before you are eligible for your CFI check ride, except the 3 hours of training with a CFI within 2 calendar months of the check ride. Looking ahead long term, so long as you keep your flight instructor certificate current by taking a computer course every 2 years, freelance instructing is something you can do for the rest of your life. Even if you lose your medical certificate and are no longer able to act as a required crew member, your skills, knowledge, and experience are valuable, and the FARs allow you to give instruction to pilots in an aircraft so long as the pilot you are working with is legally able to act as the pilot in command. In most cases, when it comes to insurance, if you become a freelance flight instructor, you are not required to carry any insurance for your services. The policy on the aircraft being used for instruction may require additional premiums to cover instruction, but it is not likely that your inexperience affects that amount by much. As an employee of a flight school, the flight school's insurance will cover you. There are 200-hour CFIs instructing at flight schools all across the country, so it is clear that most insurance companies will not have a problem with it. In regards to market factors, as was mentioned earlier, the pilot job market is always changing. As of this recording in early 2023, regional airlines have paused their hiring of 1,500-hour flight instructors. The result is that flight instructors at flight schools are staying put, and flight schools don't need to replace them. This appears to be making it more difficult to get hired as a brand new flight instructor. In contrast, just 1 year ago, a brand new flight instructor could find a job at a flight school anywhere. But this pause in regional hiring will affect all low-time flying jobs, not just instructing jobs. And in any case, this pause is bound to be temporary. Depending on when you are taking this course, the pilot job market is very likely to be different than it is at the time of this recording. Generally speaking, flight schools will always have a demand for flight instructors, and so becoming a flight instructor is one of the best bets one can make in their time-building journey. And this is why. At the top of the professional pilot food chain, so to speak, are the major airlines. These are career destination organizations such as United, Delta, FedEx, and American, and this is where many pilots will stay until they are forced by the FARs to retire at the age of 65. During the COVID pandemic, many of the major airlines incentivized pilots to take early retirement, and many pilots did. Not long after COVID, airline travel began to boom again, and major airlines found themselves short on pilots, so they began hiring. Additionally, because of the FAR that prohibits pilots over 65 years of age from acting as a crew member under Part 121, there is a large segment of pilots that will be required to retire over the next 10 or so years. This is known as a retirement wave, and it has airlines ramping up their hiring efforts in anticipation. The major airlines draw pilots from less desirable organizations, such as regional airlines. The most competitive candidates at the regional airlines are usually captains, and so these regional airline captains are the pilots who usually end up getting hired by the majors. This creates a captain shortage at the regional airlines, which regional airlines fill by upgrading their co-pilots to captain. This, in turn, creates a shortage of co-pilots, which the regional airlines fill by hiring flight instructors who meet the 1,500-hour eligibility requirement. It is the flight schools at the bottom of this food chain who must seek to fill their flight instructor shortage by hiring new flight instructors. Because pilots will always be aging to 65 and thus will be forced to retire, this chain reaction will always result in flight schools needing flight instructors. Even in downtimes or as a side gig, having a flight instructor certificate allows you to conduct one-off flight instruction services such as flight reviews, discovery flights, mock check rides, aircraft checkouts, or ground instruction sessions. As a freelance instructor, depending on your geographic location, you may be able to charge $40 to $75 per hour for your time, which can certainly help pay the bills during slow periods, or give you some extra money in your pocket. With additional ratings on your flight instructor certificate, such as your instrument, CFII, and multi-engine, MEI, ratings, your opportunities are even more numerous. You will be all the more competitive when applying to flight instructor positions and can charge even more for your time. These additional ratings can sometimes increase the quality of a flight an instructor enjoys as well. Instead of working on low-altitude ground reference maneuvers and bouncy landings with a brand new student pilot, A CFII, for example, might spend more of their time flying airways in smooth air with advanced students who are already competent and skilled pilots. In regards to previous experience, most flight schools are happy to hire brand new flight instructors. There can definitely be a learning curve involved, but the advantage all brand new instructors have is that they've all been in the student's shoes before. They have observed their own instructors at work, which gives them at least some familiarity with what they might expect working as an instructor. Because of the sheer number of flight instructor positions out there, the remaining obstacles that we discussed, including reputation and integrity, personality and presentation, public perception, geographic location, gatekeeping, and education, are not very limiting for flight instructors beyond what might be reasonably expected for any job. Should you find the idea of flight instructing unappealing, consider this. It may be that the most efficient way to build the 1,000 or so hours you need in order to land your next flying job is through instructing. Or you might instruct for a few months, log a couple hundred hours, and find yourself now eligible for a new co-pilot opportunity, which otherwise would have gone to someone else with more hours than you. This is exactly what happened to me. Just because you get your flight instructor certificate and start instructing doesn't necessarily mean you'll be stuck doing it for long. It can sometimes be the perfect short-term gig that bridges the 100 or 200 hour gap between you and a more appealing flying job. For those of you with a genuine interest in furthering your knowledge of aviation, there's no better way to go about achieving this goal than to obtain your flight instructor certificate and spend a little time instructing. Lesson plan template. As you might recall from a section earlier in the course, the act of highlighting information and writing it down in an organized way is what solidifies it in the mind. The vast majority of flight instructor training and preparation for the check ride is spent on the ground. Usually, this time is best spent creating lesson plans for each maneuver and topic found within private and commercial pilot training. My template for lesson plans was simple. 1. Maneuver or topic name. 2. What is it and why is it important? 3. When does it occur? 4. How is it performed? 5. A list of teaching aids, such as YouTube video links. 6. Common errors. 7. Any other relevant notes pertaining to the maneuver or topic. 8. ACS or PTS parameters. As a side note, there will be sample lesson plans included in the additional resources section of the course. In actuality, once complete, most instructors never actually use their created lesson plans when they begin instructing. They don't have to. That information was imprinted into their minds via the process of creating the lesson plans. Lesson plan binders, as they are known, created during the study process are usually brought to the check ride to assist in their oral exam, and then tucked away on a bookshelf until the end of time. But the knowledge and understanding that results from the creation of those plans is retained. Once the instructor begins to instruct, he or she will be forced to think deeply and critically about any given maneuver or topic in order to find a way to explain and teach a student who may be struggling with the conventional explanation. This challenge can result in the instructor coming up with an entirely new way to view a maneuver or topic, and through this, they will have gained an even deeper understanding which will serve them throughout their aviation career in whatever position they hold. By instructing in aircraft, an instructor's senses will be sharpened to notice all kinds of feelings, sights, and sounds. Through repetition and a mandatory deep understanding of each maneuver, the instructor will become ever more skilled at performing maneuvers as well as noticing subtle or not so subtle errors in their causes. There is no doubt about it. Flight instructing is an absolutely fantastic way to become a better pilot. It is not all that unusual for flight instructors to develop relationships with clients, such that when a client upgrades into larger and larger aircraft and requires a co-pilot or more experienced PIC, the client chooses to hire their flight instructor to be their pilot. This can be a great way to begin to build high-performance, multi-engine, or even turbine time, and could lead to type ratings. In fact, the mere possession of a flight instructor certificate, even if you never instruct, can open doors for you and set you apart from other candidates, as the dedication and depth of knowledge required to obtain the certificate is in itself proof of competency and can speak volumes about you. CFI training advice: teach actual students. One of the more baffling mysteries in the FARs is the fact that there is absolutely no requirement for a flight instructor to have ever spent a single moment teaching an actual student before being given the reins to teach. Sure, during training, a CFI applicant must provide quote-unquote instruction to their instructor who pretends to be a student, but the feedback they receive from their pretend student is not genuine because it can't be. The CFI applicant's instructor has already mastered the content, so holes or deficiencies in explanations are far less obvious and thus more likely to go unnoticed. The CFI check ride is just as useless to the applicant in this regard. To illustrate the absurdity from a training experience perspective, take a look at school teachers. School teachers are required to complete periods of student teaching, during which time they create and teach lessons to actual students. The process of doing that teaching to actual students, combined with constructive criticism from experienced teachers who might be supervising, inevitably provides very usable, genuine feedback. These student teachers study this feedback and are able to learn and adapt their lesson plans and teaching methods. They begin to develop a better picture of what works and what doesn't, so that by the time they pass their tests and begin teaching in a classroom of their own, they already have many hours of real teaching under their belts. This process of genuine teaching is wholly absent from the flight instructor training process. Initially, I struggled during my CFI training. My light bulb moment occurred when my instructor had me teach the entire cross-country ground lesson to one of his student pilots. The student asked certain questions and made certain comments which never would have been generated in the mind of my instructor. Nothing against my instructor. He was older, with thousands of hours under his belt, and it had just been so long since he was a student pilot that his brain was not wired that way anymore. As a CFI myself, I could probably do no better now at pretending to be a student than he could. Teaching that single lesson was so impactful, in fact, that I immediately began asking all of my friends if they would let me teach them about flying and provide feedback. To make it more enjoyable, I tried to teach each friend a lesson that was as relevant to their interests as possible. For example, I taught my lesson on the 4 forces of flight to my friend who was a college physics student. This way, she was more interested and was able to provide more useful feedback. I also took friends up in the airplane to go flying and tried my hand at giving them mock instruction on basic maneuvers. While my study methods and the creation of my lesson plans solidified the knowledge in my head, teaching real student pilots and people brand new to aviation was how I learned to actually teach. I cannot overstate how beneficial this was to my development as a CFI, and so I highly recommend that if you choose to pursue your flight instructor certificate, don't settle solely for teaching your instructor. Find student pilots, and with their permission and the permission of their instructors, teach a few ground lessons. Incentivize the student with free ground lessons in exchange for their feedback with an understanding that you know the material, but you are learning how to teach. Allow their instructor to sit nearby and give feedback as well if they'd like. See if you might be able to ride along as a passenger during one of their training flights to observe flight instruction taking place from a third-person perspective. You have endured many hours of instruction as a student by now, but sitting in as an observer may allow you to focus on the instruction itself, and you may notice things that you hadn't before. Some students or instructors might turn you down, as this may be too distracting, and that is okay. Flight lessons should always put the needs of the student first, but it never hurts to ask. Types of flight instructor jobs. You can probably categorize flight instructing jobs into 3 different types: freelance, flight school employee, and aircraft manufacturer or turbine aircraft flight instructor. Freelance flight instructor. This is my favorite type of instructing job. As a freelance instructor, you will instruct under Part 61. So long as your students complete what the FARs under Part 61 require before their check ride, you are bound to no particular syllabus or rigid lesson outline. You can instruct in any airworthy and registered aircraft for which you hold the appropriate ratings. You can charge whatever you'd like, set your own hours, work as little or as much as you want, be selective of which students with whom you'd like to work, and design your own course outlines and lessons. You can market yourself and keep every penny you make, or you can work with an FBO or flight school as a 1099 independent contractor and perhaps give them a small cut for referring students your way, commonly about 20 to 30%. Your geographic location and the ratings you hold on your flight instructor certificate will influence how much you can charge. As a freelance CFI, $40 to $75 per hour is common. A CFII, $65 to $85 per hour, and an MEI, $70 to over $100 per hour. These are approximate amounts, but it may be more or less where you are located. Large cities with a high cost of living will warrant higher rates, and small rural towns will probably warrant less. You may also choose to charge flat rates, such as a daily rate for students who want multiple hours of instruction in a day, or a flat rate for flight reviews or mock check rides. As a CFI, $200 to $350 per day is not unreasonable if you choose to go this route. Instruction given in larger, more powerful and complex aircraft also warrant an increase in rates, and any time you are asked to accompany a student on a long or multi-day trip, they should absolutely cover all of your meals, lodging expenses, and any additional travel expenses incurred, such as one-way airline tickets, etc. As long as you keep renewing your flight instructor certificate every 2 years, freelance instructing is something you can do on the side throughout your aviation career. Many pilots whose careers have them flying large aircraft choose to spend some of their days off making some extra money instructing. Further, once you've retired from such a job, your current flight instructor certificate will allow you to stay in the air and stay involved. Expectations of students. My favorite teacher of all time had extremely high expectations for his students. As in, there really was absolutely no excuse for not learning the material, which happened to be Algebra 2 and Physics. He spent every one of his lunch periods in his classroom, willing to help guide students to the answers to their questions. No spoon feeding, though. And he hung around for a few hours after school every day to offer that same help. He provided deadline dates weeks in advance so that we could plan appropriately. He gave his students every advantage he could to allow them to succeed, so long as they took initiative and did the legwork. By offering such a resource to us students, he placed the responsibility to succeed squarely on our shoulders. He never budged on rounding a term GPA up from an 89.9%, which is a B, to a 90%, an A. He didn't coddle or baby students in any way. He did this because he cared. He cared about our success, and he cared enough about us to teach us, sometimes using tough love, absolute personal responsibility and ownership when it comes to learning. I took this approach with flight instructing. I had high expectations of my students, and I gave them every resource they needed to be successful, including my phone number, to call at any time of day to ask me questions, free of charge. My job as an instructor was to keep the students safe in the air and help guide them along the process of obtaining their pilot certificate, and federal law prohibited me from endorsing any student for a solo flight or check ride if I did not feel they were knowledgeable, safe, and competent. And I genuinely did care about their success. As previously stated, I charged for my time, but my job description was not to spend my time poking, prodding, or babysitting someone who wasn't motivated to do the work that was required. Flying an airplane is a massive responsibility, and if a student didn't have the motivation to put in the time and effort, that student just wouldn't have had the knowledge necessary to pass any evaluations, and they would usually weed themselves out in an unfortunately expensive manner. If a student insisted on paying me $50 to $60 per hour for me to spoon feed them paragraphs from the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, that was easy money for me, and I would do it once or twice until they hopefully realized that it's a horrible use of their time and money. Being spoon-fed information is easy, but it is an incredibly inefficient way to learn. Recall the section on how to study earlier in this course. Based on my experience, this student was not likely to be successful in achieving their goal if they remained on that trajectory. Charging for your time. Here are some actual numbers that might help you determine what is a fair wage when it comes to freelance instructing. When I was actively instructing throughout the Willamette Valley in Oregon between 2017 and 2019, I charged $50 per hour as a freelance CFI to students that I acquired through my own marketing, and I charged $40 per hour as a 1099 CFI for a local flight school who found students for me. This was all Part 61. I found these rates to be fair for a CFI, not a CFII or MEI, with about 500 hours total time. My own philosophy while instructing was based on my own life views. As far as I'm concerned, time is the most finite resource we have as humans. As of 2020, the average human lifespan was about 636,000 hours. Since you will be asleep for a third of that, this leaves about 420,000 hours in your life to be awake and conscious, doing what you love with the people you love, and doing what you must to make ends meet. For this reason, in whatever it is that I'm doing, I charge for my time. To that end, my policy with student pilots was simple. The student would pay me when I was giving them any of my limited 420,000 hours. This meant that from the moment of our agreed upon meeting time to the moment I put my signature in their logbook, they were paying me. I found this approach reasonable because I'm not out to gut anyone's wallet. In fact, I did everything in my power to help a student's dollars go as far as they could. I love being efficient with my time and money, and I love helping others do the same. I began learning to fly as a senior in high school. Though I was blessed to grow up in an upper-middle-class household, an extreme advantage, no doubt, my parents did not pay for my flight training. I worked 2 jobs after school and on weekends, and over the course of 10 months and 42 hours of flight time, I was able to obtain my pilot's license. Working for minimum wage meant I had to make each and every penny go as far as possible. I was fortunate to work with an instructor who gave me a discount on her time, but in exchange, the expectations were high. I needed to show up prepared and ready to go. I made a boneheaded comment to my CFI when I was 17 and learning to fly. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was along the lines of my instructor benefiting from training me in the form of hours and experience. I cringe when I think about what I said, especially now that I've lived through the process of becoming and working as a CFI. 17-year-olds. Acquiring all of the certifications and paying for all of that flight time throughout training was expensive and a lot of work, and instructors should absolutely be paid well for the experience they bring to the table and the service they provide, most notably keeping students from killing themselves and others with an airplane. At the same time, I'm very sensitive to the money-strapped student pilot. In fact, I was happy to give a good rate to students I worked with who were in a situation similar to mine to help pass along my flight instructor's generosity and keep flying as accessible as possible too. If my students communicated to me and were upfront about their situation, and if they showed up early and very prepared, I would do all I could to keep their costs minimized, even if that meant I didn't get paid quite as much. Of course, even if a student was not strapped for cash, I tried to be efficient with all of my students. I let them know during our first lesson what my policy would be. I would begin charging from the moment of our agreed upon meeting time to the moment I put my signature in their logbook. If the student was running late, I still charged from our agreed upon meeting time. This policy was especially important when I was commuting 45 minutes each way to the airport to instruct. In that situation, I wasn't going to charge for my commute time, as it was my choice to live and work where I did. But I was going to charge for all the scheduled time during which I was at the airport on behalf of my students, whether they were present or not. As primary training progresses, it is my belief that students should get used to performing pre-flights on their own, and this independence will only develop in the absence of an instructor's presence. Once it became apparent to me that my student could completely fuel and pre-flight the airplane on their own, I encouraged them to show up 15 to 20 minutes before our meeting time, pre-flight the aircraft, add fuel, and be ready to fly the moment I arrived. Being paid to watch a competent student perform a mundane pre-flight is a waste of an instructor's time and a waste of a student's money. My routine when I arrived was to have a quick talk about what we would be doing that day, make a quick walk around the airplane, double-check oil and fuel caps, always do this as a CFI, a lesson I learned the hard way, get in, shut the door, and fire up. In an effort to be efficient, I was always adamant about letting my students know beforehand what it is we would be working on during the next lesson, and I did my best to supply this information well in advance. It was my hope that the student would read up on or watch videos regarding the maneuvers or lesson content so that when we met, my student could ask good questions, or at the very least, they would have been exposed to the maneuver or concept beforehand. I found that students reviewing the maneuver or concept on their own time was a much better way to prepare them than discussing the content in depth just before going flying. I was not militant or without reason with my charging policies. For example, as the experienced professional, if I looked at the forecast the night before a lesson scheduled at 6 a.m. the next morning, and the weather forecast was looking questionable, I either canceled the next morning's lesson that night or made the judgment call to continue as planned. As you probably know by now, when planning to operate out of an airport with minimal or no weather reporting, sometimes you've got to use webcams, make phone calls, use satellite imagery, make educated guesses about the conditions at the airport based on weather reporting at stations nearby and common weather patterns, or get in the car and drive to the airport to see for yourself. In my case, I was operating out of such an airport, and living 45 minutes away, sometimes my best efforts proved to be in vain. Sometimes, when all my tools and experience predicted a clear morning, after making the 45-minute drive, I would discover a 200-foot thick patch of thick fog covering the airport, and in some cases, the fog would end up sticking around for many hours, resulting in a reschedule. When this happened, I did not charge the student for my time, as making the choice to meet as planned was my choice, even though I made my best judgment call. It happens. As students progress in their training, I then put this judgment call on their shoulders, and hopefully they had been studying meteorology and paying attention to local weather patterns. My thoughts were that at some point soon, they would have to become comfortable being the one to make the go, no-go decision as the pilot command. Once they were ready, I let them decide, based on the forecast for the next morning and their knowledge of local weather patterns, if we should cancel in advance or meet as planned that next morning. If I disagreed with the decision to meet as planned the next morning, I let them know. If I showed up and there was a maintenance issue with the aircraft, I did not charge the student. If there were unforeseen life circumstances or events that could not have been predicted by my student and they were late or had to cancel, I was reasonable and took them on a case-by-case basis. I certainly had my fair share of last-minute curveballs during my own training, and I was understanding that sometimes life happens. Overall, I found my policy to be fair, as did practically every student I worked with. The few who took issue with my policy were welcome to find a different instructor, and, as any professional flight instructor should, I did not take that personally. I encourage everyone to charge a fair price for their time, in whatever profession they work, as time is the ultimate non-renewable resource. Flight school employee. The most common flight instructor job for a new flight instructor is probably working for an established flight school. The primary advantage of this type of job is that you do not need to spend time or money marketing yourself and finding students. The flight school takes care of that and simply pairs you with their students based on the flight school's needs. You also don't need to worry about finding a rental aircraft, insurance, classroom space, or other administrative concerns. You may get benefits, and you will probably be able to build hours faster due to a large volume of students who need instruction. The disadvantage is that you will be paid significantly less, usually anywhere from $18 to $25 per hour, and you might have less control over your schedule. The lower wages usually have more to do with the fact that flight schools, typically operating under Part 141, have higher overhead costs as a result of the additional regulations imposed under Part 141. You may also have to work under poor management. Some schools expect their instructors to essentially work for free by the way they bill time to students. For example, a school may only bill a student for their flight training based on Hobbs time. They may only pay the instructor based on that Hobbs time as well, even though the instructor spent 20 minutes of their time helping to fuel and pre-flight the airplane. This unpaid time can add up fast. An instructor for a flight school may find themselves spending 8 to 9 hours at the airport while only being paid for 5 of those hours. Flight schools may offer instruction under Part 61, Part 141, or both. No matter what type of instructor job you take, the aircraft's or flight school's insurer will almost certainly require you to complete a checkout flight in the aircraft in which you'll be instructing. This can be as quick as a single lap in the pattern and a single landing, or it might include some air work. If the flight school is operated under Part 141, regulations require your training or checkout flights to be a little more in-depth. There's also quite a bit more paperwork involved in Part 141 flight training. You might find yourself working for a flight school associated with a college or university, and this carries its own set of challenges. Colleges and universities are very large organizations, and their flight schools are but one of many departments that must be managed. This can create quite a few inefficiencies and red tape that must be overcome, for both flight instructors and students. These flight schools will usually try to batch and schedule certain phases of flight training with their corresponding classes at the college. For example, a fall term private pilot class will usually coincide with private pilot flight training. If a commercial pilot class is offered during spring term, that is usually when the flight school will try to conduct the majority of the commercial pilot flight training. You might be paired with a set of 5 to 7 students with whom you will work throughout the term, or that portion of their training. This means that as an instructor, you may teach the same ground and flight lesson 5 to 7 times per day, each time to a different one of your 5 to 7 students, and you will do this all term. It can get repetitive and monotonous, but at the same time, this also allows you to experiment with how you deliver the information so that you can refine and improve your lessons. Pathway programs. As mentioned previously, some flight schools have partnered with airlines to provide pathway programs for their instructors so that upon reaching ATP minimums, they are immediately hired at an airline, usually a regional. This perk is unique to established flight schools, so you won't be eligible for it if you work solely as a freelance flight instructor. However, it is easily possible to work for a flight school and work as a freelance instructor at the same time, so one could get the best of both worlds if they wanted to. Aircraft manufacturer or turbine aircraft flight instructor. Generally reserved for pilots on the more experienced end of what might be considered low time, flight instructing for an aircraft manufacturer can be a great job, and for some, it ends up being a position at which they spend a significant portion of their career. For example, Cirrus Aircraft states, among other requirements, that a candidate must have a minimum of 1,000 hours logged to be eligible for their flight instructor position. Their instructor positions pay $50,000 to $70,000 per year plus benefits and allows the instructor to be home most nights. It is not the most lucrative flying job in the world, but the quality of life might be exactly what you are looking for. Never undervalue being home every night. Instructors who work this job are probably treated more professionally than those working at a more conventional flight school, and these instructors are frequently flying in advanced, comfortable, brand new Cirrus aircraft. There are a number of aircraft manufacturers that offer similar positions. If you obtain your MEI and a type rating in a jet or other turbine aircraft, you will be legally qualified to instruct in that aircraft. Some professionals make a career out of traveling the country, giving initial and recurrent training. Though most insurance companies require simulator training, some allow training to be conducted in the actual aircraft, and this training can be very valuable in its own way. Performing full stalls and stall recoveries, shutting down and restarting an engine in flight, and simulating a dead stick landing to a runway in a jet from 10,000 feet over the field are just a few of the very cool experiences unique to this type of training. I was once offered such a job, traveling the country and giving instruction Cessna Citation aircraft. I would have been paid $800 each day that I was away from home, and all expenses would be covered. The job would have involved giving some ground instruction through PowerPoints and spending an hour or two in the client's aircraft doing some easy air work and simulated emergencies before they took their proficiency check with a guy who would have been my boss. Not a bad way to make money. Depending on your location, you may be able to get a job as a co-pilot in an aircraft simulator at a Part 142 training center. During client training or check rides, training centers often hire pilots to sit in the right seat to act as the co-pilot. The opportunity to meet and network with pilots this way can lead to part-time, contract, or full-time turbine flying jobs. These positions can also eventually lead to a heavily discounted or even free type rating from the training center. This is a perk that can improve the co-pilot's performance on the job and is often offered to the employee in an effort to help create a better experience for the clients. Flight instructor employers. There's quite a bit to know about finding a job, and an entire section of this course is dedicated specifically to that subject. But if you'd like some immediate actionable advice specific to flight instructor positions, the following information should be helpful. In order to find potential flight instructor employers, a Google search of the phrase flight instruction in the desired location or learn to fly in the desired location should bring up a number of Part 61 and 141 flight training facilities. They might be advertising job openings on their website, or you might send them an email or give them a call to ask about job openings. Relevant low-time pilot Facebook groups might also be worth perusing, as employers frequently use this resource to advertise openings. Further, the FAA has a searchable database of all Part 141 FAA-approved flight schools, which can be found at the link shown. If you are looking for local employment, walking into your local FBO or flight school with a resume and speaking with company personnel can go a long way. If they are actively seeking flight instructors, there's no better way to assure an interview than visiting in person. They might even ask to interview you on the spot. If you are a freelance instructor, create a professional business card and leave a stack of them at your local FBO. Include all of your ratings and certifications on your business card, CFI, CFII, tailwheel, type ratings, etc., so potential clients can see the types of training you provide or the experience that you have. Be sure to network with other instructors on the field as well, as referrals from other instructors are one of the best ways to acquire students.